Forward. In a private collection in Japan, there is a remarkable painting, nearly 400 years old, of a shrike on a withered branch. Done in monochrome India ink and measuring about 4 feet high by 1.5 feet wide, it expresses a tension and clarity of spirit that seem to go far beyond the bounds of its relatively few lines. The shrike sits with extraordinary attention and concentration, its sharp beak a subtle and almost cruel curve, its gaze cast into the void. It is clearly a bird such as we rarely see in our backyards. As we continue to look at this work, it is the single stroke depicting the greater part of the branch that becomes most arresting. Rising up from the bottom left of the painting and cutting through its near center, it is grace and strength in a single quick movement, standing out against nothingness. The observer might conclude that the painter must have been, in a sense, absolutely fearless. How else the decisiveness and total self-confidence of this one sword-like stroke? The painter's name was Niten, or Two Heavens. More exactly, Niten was the artistic name of one Shinmen Musashi, or Miyamoto Musashi. With the publication of the Book of Five Rings, I feel a sense of completion on what might be considered a short cycle of translations of works centering around Japanese warrior thought and concerns. Musashi, who was the ultimate combatant on the field, reveals his techniques for defeating one's opponent through spirit, awareness, and discipline. For him, the only goal is victory. There is no other point to combat, whether in one-on-one confrontations or on the battlefield for his lord. What is gained along the way of this discipline, however, is a grasp of all the other arts, both martial and literary. In The Unfettered Mind, the Zen priest Takuan, a contemporary of Musashi, teaches the defeat of the interfering ego, the overriding sense of self over which we often stumble, specifically in its first essay, The Mysterious Record of Immovable Wisdom. Writing to one of the sword masters to the shogun, Takuan uses the example of martial combat to explain the Zen approach to handling the ego, and so deals with the transcendental area, including both life and death. In the third work of this cycle, the Hagakure, Yamamoto Tsunetomo considers the warrior values of loyalty, duty, and righteousness, and finds his ultimate realization of these matters in death. To Tsunetomo, a man's death demonstrated his sincerity, and in considering himself as already dead, he was able to complete his daily work with utter peace and tranquility. Musashi, Takuan, and Tsunetomo, it would seem, are concerned with the elimination of fear and how to engage in life in a straightforward and unwavering manner. It is Musashi, however, who deals with the subject with an astonishing practicality and realism, and he encourages us to cut through any obstacles with energy and self-reliance. Asking no aid from the gods and Buddhas, we brace ourselves only with an internalized way. Musashi wrote the Book of Five Rings toward the very end of his life, after fighting in over 60 individual matches and at least 3 major battles on the field. That we have such easy access to his reflections on his life and death experiences should, I think, be both congratulatory and an admonishment, for it grants us the ability to be conversant with the wisdom learned from intense experiences that very few of us will ever have, and may show us how lightly we take our own lives and potential. Accordingly, while the Book of Five Rings will be of extraordinary interest to practitioners of the martial arts and students of Japanese culture, its study will be of value for anyone whose life encompasses conflict. Musashi's original manuscript of 5 scrolls no longer exists, but the various copies made differ only slightly in some of the words and phrases. Remarkably, the copy presented by Musashi's disciple Terao Nobomasa to Yamamoto Gensuke in 1667, only 20 years after Musashi's death, is still in the possession of the Hosokawa family, whose ancestor, the daimyo Hosokawa Tadatoshi, was Musashi's primary benefactor. It is considered to be the most accurate of those extant, and it is the copy upon which this translation is based. Any and all mistakes are my own. William Scott Wilson, October 10th, 2000. Introduction. We have very few reliable facts about Musashi's life. His own words on the subject fill less than a page at the beginning of the Book of Five Rings, and later accounts such as the Nintenki or the Tanba Hokin Hikei were all written 80 to 130 years after his death. However, a bare-bones biography might be pieced together with events that are commonly accepted as true from the sources that are available. These include a memorial inscription of stone erected 9 years after Musashi's death by his adopted son and the priest with whom the swordsman studied Zen Buddhism in his later years, plus what was noted of his comings and goings by the Hosokawa clan in northern Kyushu. We must exclude legendary feats of speed and skill attributed to Musashi, since they are at once unreliable and go against the spirit of Musashi's writings. Those interested in the full gamut of stories that grew up around Musashi's life should read Musashi, the endlessly entertaining historical fiction written by Yoshikawa Eiji, or see the film Samurai Trilogy, directed by Inagaki Hiroshi. Musashi. In the Book of Five Rings, Musashi notes that he was born in Harima, but there is also evidence that he came from the village of Miyamoto in Mimasaka. Neither claim can be proven. The date of his birth is unclear, but according to his own account, he was born in 1584. His father, Shinmen Munasai, was said to be a master of the jita, a small metal club with an extended thumb for countering a sword, and may have left the family when Musashi was quite young. When Musashi was 13, he fought and defeated a swordsman of the Shinto style, Arima Kihei, in Harima. His second match and subsequent victory was at the age of 16, when he defeated a martial artist from Tajima by the name of Akiyama. It is said that he joined the Toyotomi forces, which lost at the historically decisive Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, but this too is uncertain. The next few years must have been spent in hard training, for at the age of 21 Musashi went to Kyoto and fought a series of engagements with the Yoshioka clan, which held the position of martial arts instructor to the shogun's family in that city. After maiming the eldest brother, Yoshioka Seijuro, with a wooden sword, and killing the second brother, Denshichiro, Musashi fought off a group of Yoshioka disciples who, beneath the pines of the Ichijo temple, tried but failed to take revenge. It is said that it was during the fight with Seijuro that Musashi's eyes were opened to the two heavens, or two-sword style. Leaving the Yoshiokas in disarray, Musashi met and defeated a disciple of the famous Inei, a spearman priest at the Hozoin. Traveling to Edo, he then fought Muso Gonosuke, the famous staff martial artist, in the only contest that may have been considered a draw. A little later, he fought and defeated a practitioner of the Yagyu style, a style that would become one of the most famous of the period. Moving on to Iga, he met with the well-known sickle and chain martial artist Shishido Baiken and defeated him as well. In April of 1612, Musashi left Kyoto and went to Kokura in northern Kyushu. There he sought out one of his father's former disciples, now a senior official of the Kokura fief, in order to gain permission to have a match with Gunryu Sasaki Kojiro. Kojiro was employed as a sword teacher to the Hosokawa clan, and was famous for his long drying pole sword and swallow style. This famous match was held on Funashima, now called Gunryujima, a small lonely island in the sea off Kokura. Tradition has it that as Musashi was being rowed to the island, he carved a wooden sword from an extra oar, and it was with this sword that he quickly brained his unfortunate opponent. Kojiro did not survive the blow. According to some accounts, Musashi next surfaced in 1615 to take part in the military action at Osaka Castle, the final fall of the Toyotomi clan. After that, he seems to have set out through the northern provinces of Dewa and Hitachi, where he may have taken on his disciple Iori, who was later to become his adopted son. He then returned to Nagoya in Owari and toured a number of other provinces, always seeking out matches with other martial artists. In 1634, Musashi traveled again to Kokura, now under the authority of Ogasawara Tadazane, and stayed a number of years. In 1637, he seems to have participated in the attack on Hara Castle during the Shimabara Rebellion, in which he received several wounds. Having returned to Kyoto for recuperation, he is said to have met Hosokawa Tadatoshi, the master of Kumamoto Castle, at a literary group in 1640, and to have been invited by the latter to stay as a guest with his own residence in the castle town. Musashi accepted and continued to practice and teach his martial art there. In February of 1641, at the request of Lord Hosokawa, Musashi wrote down the 35 articles of the martial arts. This was the first time he recorded his own style in writing, and it was from this document in outline form that he eventually would write the Book of Five Rings. Tragically, Tadatoshi passed away shortly afterward at the age of 54, dashing Musashi's hopes for an official endorsement of his style. Thus began a period when the famous swordsman concentrated increasingly on poetry, tea, painting, and sculpture. By 1643, Musashi must have felt the intimations of what was to be a fatal disease. On October 10th of that year, in an act of purification, he climbed Mount Iwato in the province of Higo on the island of Kyushu, bowed in veneration to heaven, worshipped Kannon and stood before the Buddha, and began to compose the Book of Five Rings. This he would complete after 2 years of meditation on his experiences. Around the springtime of 1645, his disease, which is thought to have been some form of thoracic cancer, gradually worsened, and in April he retreated to the Reigan Cave on Mount Iwato, also called Mount Iwatono, where he had practiced zazen during previous years, and where he wanted to wait peacefully for death. However, he was convinced to return to his residence, where he could be looked after by his disciples. On May 12th, his disease becoming critical, Musashi gave out parting gifts to his disciples. His final act was to write out The Way of Walking Alone, or The Way of Self-Reliance, 21 points on self-discipline for later generations. On May 19th, 1645, Miyamoto Shinmen Musashi died at his residence, by most accounts at the age of 62. A requiem was given soon after by the priest Shunzan, with whom Musashi had studied Zen. As the priest intoned the sutras, it is said that the sky suddenly clouded over and there was an enormous clap of thunder. Thus was it known that the great swordsman had passed away. The Kyoto Renaissance. I have never had a teacher while studying the ways of the various arts and accomplishments, or in anything at all. The Earth Chapter. This is an astonishing statement from a man who was not only one of the most famous swordsmen of his time, but also an extraordinarily skilled painter, sculptor, and metallurgist. We also know that Musashi was well acquainted with poetry, the way of tea, the recitation of No drama, and perhaps even carpentry. This necessitates an adjustment of the picture we may have of him as a man of strength and skill, both qualities he would regard as of secondary importance, who did little other than wander the country engaging other martial artists in matches he inevitably won. In order to make that adjustment, we must consider the world in which he lived and the people with whom he may have been in contact. Musashi was active during a time aptly called the Kyoto Renaissance, a period stretching approximately 50 years on either side of the year 1600. After suffering a devastating century and a half of civil wars during which countless art treasures were destroyed, ancient temples and buildings burned, and libraries lost forever, Japan was brought back to unification and eventual peace by the efforts of 3 successive warlords. Oda Nobunaga, 1534–82, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, 1536–98, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, 1542–1616. After so many years of social disruption, the response to this peace was a surge in economic prosperity and a concomitant flourishing of the arts in almost every arena. Castle architecture blossomed. There was a new interest in classical poetry and painting. The art of the tea ceremony reached its height. The world of ceramics spread in new directions, and schools in the martial arts proliferated, with every new disciple striking out on his own. How the various players of this period influenced Musashi is not documented, but considering his artistic talent and curiosity, his insistence that we know all the arts, and the time he spent in Kyoto, it is germane, I think, to look briefly at two men representative of the period with whom he is likely to have associated. At the aesthetic center of the Kyoto Renaissance was Honami Koetsu, 1558 to 1637, a man whom tradition, if not recorded evidence, links with Musashi. Koetsu came from a family of sword polishers and appraisers, well known in that field since the 14th century, and was much in demand for his skills in this work. Still, there were very few other arts that he did not practice. Granted by the shogun an area of land, Takagamine or Takaramine, just outside of Kyoto, he established an art colony that would act as a sort of launching pad for everything from paper-making to lacquerware to pottery. Koetsu himself is best known today for his calligraphy and pottery, but his strong ties to the samurai sword and his intense and friendly personality must have made him a congenial, sometime companion for the lone martial artist. Koetsu's strong interest in no recitation may have sparked Musashi's later participation in that art as well. One of Koetsu's friends, Sakon Daiju, was the head of the Kanza school of No, and it is not unlikely that Musashi would have made his acquaintance along with many others in the arts. Among Koetsu's other associates were Tawaraya Sotatsu, the painter, Furuta Uribe, the warrior and tea master, Raku Donyu, the potter to the tea masters, and Hayashi Razan, the Confucian scholar. Musashi could not have helped being influenced by this society of talented men, even if only peripherally, and Koetsu's reputed strong character and intense dislike of greed would have fit well with the same tendencies in the swordsman's personality. Musashi insisted that through an intense study and practice of the way of the martial arts, the ways of all other arts would be understood. That his acquaintance with the older sword polisher turned aesthete may have helped open his eyes to this understanding is not recorded, but the jovial shadow of Honami Koetsu seems indeed to pass over the pages of the Book of Five Rings. Takuan Soho, 1573 to 1645, a Zen Buddhist priest of the Rinzai sect, was another influential character of the Kyoto Renaissance traditionally connected to Musashi. Like Koetsu, Takuan was a polymath who excelled in calligraphy, painting, poetry, gardening, and the tea ceremony. He must have also enjoyed being in the kitchen, for he invented the pickle, still used as a constant in the Japanese diet, and, to this day, it retains his name. Takuan was a prodigious writer whose collected works fill 6 volumes. He was an advisor to the emperor and shogun alike, and became abbot of the Daitokuji, a major Zen temple in Kyoto, by the age of 35. The tradition that names Takuan an instructor to Musashi is interesting in a number of ways, but is brought to focus in Takuan's essay, The Mysterious Record of Immovable Wisdom, written not to Musashi, but to Yagyu Munenori, the head of the Shinkage style of swordsmanship. The work deals in part with the relationship of the mind, body, and technique, a subject covered extensively in the Book of Five Rings. In the very beginning of his essay, Takuan tells us, "What is called Fudomyo, a wrathful manifestation of the central Buddha Vairocana, is said to be one's unmoving mind and an unvacillating body. Unvacillating means not being detained by anything. Glancing at something and not stopping the mind is called immovable. This is because when the mind stops at something, the breast is filled with various judgments, and there are various movements within it. When its movements cease, the stopping mind moves, but does not move at all. When you first notice the sword that is moving to strike you, if you think of meeting that sword just as it is, your mind will stop at the sword in just that position. Your own movements will be undone, and you will be cut down by your opponent." The action of spark and stone underscores the point that the mind should not be detained by things. It says that even with speed, it is essential that the mind does not stop. When the mind stops, it will be grasped by the opponent. On the other hand, if the mind contemplates being fast and goes into quick action, it will be captured by its own contemplation. Putting the mind in one place is called falling into one-sidedness. One-sidedness is said to be bias in one place. Correctness is in moving about anywhere. The correct mind shows itself by extending the mind throughout the body. It is not biased in any one place. The effort not to stop the mind in just one place. This is discipline. Not stopping the mind is the object and essence. Put nowhere, it will be everywhere. Even in moving the mind outside the body, if it is sent in one direction, it will be lacking in 9 others. If the mind is not restricted to just one direction, it will be in all 10. This is one of the main, mostly implicit themes that runs like a current throughout the Book of Five Rings. And while these words in no way exhaust the subject of the relationship between the sword and Zen, they are most certainly at the very center of the subject. One can imagine Musashi listening quietly and drinking them in like pure water. Musashi's association with the artists and Buddhist priests of the Kyoto Renaissance cannot be accurately documented, but at the same time, in no way can it be dismissed. It is clear that in terms of his own development from rural birth to being both an undefeated swordsman and talented multiple artist, he would have had, if not teachers, then companions and associates on the way. Kyoto is and always has been a very connected society, with strong relationships among people of high aesthetic abilities. Nor was this social network limited to Kyoto. Even in his wanderings around the country, Musashi may well have encountered eccentric Zen artists. His contemporary Fugai comes to mind, as surely as he encountered the 60-odd martial artists he would fight and defeat. Musashi's final domicile, where he taught, meditated, and wrote his book, was not Kyoto, but faraway Kumamoto in northern Kyushu. Yet even this place was the home of the Hosokawa, one of Japan's oldest and most artistic warrior clans. And while his main benefactor there was the daimyo Hosokawa Tadatoshi, he would likely have met and talked with the latter's father, Tadaoki, a master politician, a master in the way of tea, a campaigner of every talent, and a lacquerware artist beyond compare. We can see Musashi having tea with the old man, the rough hands that held the sword so many times, cradling a Chojiro tea bowl, and talking about the way of the warrior. For those who would study my martial art, there are rules for putting it into practice. Touch upon all of the arts. From the Earth Chapter. Buddhism and the Book of Five Rings. Much has been made of Musashi's Buddhism, and, paradoxically, his lack of the same. In the very beginning of the Book of Five Rings, he tells us that before starting the book, he bowed in veneration to heaven, worshipped Kannon, and stood before the Buddha. A few lines later, he informs us that in writing this book, I am not borrowing the ancient words of Buddhism. And then, I will express the heart of truth, using the ways of heaven and Kanzeon as mirrors. Accordingly, we can see that Musashi had something of Buddhism in his heart, but he would not try to give his experiences and words legitimacy by invoking Buddhism in his words. It is clear in the Book of Five Rings that the Zen Buddhist insistence on absolute personal experience and transcendence of the interfering self is one of the touchstones of Musashi's thought. We also have the tradition of his relationship with the Zen priest Takuan and the Hosokawa records of his studying Zen under Abbot Shunzan. But Zen Buddhism was hardly the only religion during Musashi's time. Honami Koetsu came from a long line of Nichiren sect Buddhists, and indeed, most of the artists at his colony in Takagamine belonged to that sect. Hosokawa Tadaoki's wife, Gracia was a Japanese Christian, although Tadaoki was not. Then there is the Shingon Buddhist faith, which has run like an undercurrent in Japanese culture since the 8th century, a sect which believes that anything of beauty, in nature or in art, partakes of the Buddha nature. Could Musashi, as a wanderer through the countryside and an artist, have been immune to such ideas? How much did Musashi's religious convictions or practices influence his martial art? The Book of Five Rings gives us only a hint, but it is worthwhile, I think, to look at that hint with a little more focus. The Five Rings, which is both part of the title and forms the structure of the book, refers to the Buddhist theory of the five elements, and Musashi gives only a short statement for the choice of this motif. Earth, because it symbolized his fundamental view of the martial arts. Water, because of his own style based on fluidity and purity. Fire, or battle, because of its energy and ability for quick change. Wind, the other style, because of the double meaning, wind and style, of the Chinese character. And emptiness, because this is ultimately the place from which all other activities come. The five elements come from a long religious tradition and are used as objects of meditation in many different ways. Musashi, inquisitive as he was, would have been at least conversant with these. Besides their traditional characteristics of solidity and hardness, earth, fluidity, water, heat and activity, fire, motion, wind, and the encompassment of all the other four, emptiness, the five elements have each traditionally been aligned with a direction and a meditation Buddha as well. Thus, the earth contains the direction south and the Buddha Ratnasambhava, water, the east and the Buddha Ashkopya, fire, the west and the Buddha Amitabha, wind or air, the north and the Buddha Amagasiti, and emptiness, the center of all directions and the central Buddha Vairocana. Each of these Buddhas has its own meaning, color, symbol, and transformational wisdom. In esoteric Buddhism, each of them, along with their respective qualities, is to be meditated on in turn as a method of more effective resolution of life's problems and as a way leading to eventual enlightenment. Such meanings would have been clear to Musashi and his disciples, but would not necessarily have been spelled out by Musashi in a book on martial arts. The significance of the selection of the five elements for both the title and the structure of his work, however, remains. In passing, it is interesting to note that one of Musashi's most famous sculptures depicts Fudomyo, a wrathful manifestation of the central Buddha Vairocana, who represents the fundamental nature of the universe. This Fudomyo, whose name means immovable wisdom king, is represented with a sword to cut through our ignorance and a rope to bind up our emotions, actions Musashi deemed essential in the martial arts for being more effective. While given a wrathful expression, the figure is moved fundamentally by compassion, the very essence of the Kannon whom Musashi worshipped before writing this book. Both Fudo and Kannon are the symbols of the unshakable tranquility Musashi sought to translate to his students in their moments of life and death. Musashi wrote the Book of Five Rings at the end of his life as a guidebook for the disciples he had taught face to face. It was a broad outline, in a sense, of work he had done with them over a period of years, a reminder or prompt to guide them after he was gone. Some items were apparently so inimical to the written word that, after a line or two defining the subject, he simply wrote, "This is an oral tradition," meaning that it had to be passed on person to person, rather than in a book. Though the vehicle of this book is technique, its essence is mind. To Musashi, the martial arts were an approach or psychology to the way. They were not something to be bought and sold, as so many of the martial arts schools, both then and now, make them out to be, nor were they something to decorate one's life. Conflict is real. The way is real. The student must use his or her real experience to resolve the two. And it is mind, far more than technique, that will be the enabler. Musashi insisted on the importance of real experience, and the reader should not miss the fact that the phrase, "You should investigate this thoroughly," is repeated more than any other in the book. 1 week before he died, Musashi continued to press his points home. Picking up his brush and, as the Zen masters would say, with the kindness of an old grandmother, he wrote out The Way of Self-Reliance, or literally, The Way of Walking Alone. 21 items to help the students of the future nail down what was theirs alone. It is fitting to end this short introduction with what would be his last admonition. The Way of Walking Alone, or The Way of Self-Reliance. Do not turn your back on the various ways of this world. Do not scheme for physical pleasure. Do not intend to rely on anything. Consider yourself lightly. Consider the world deeply. Do not ever think in acquisitive terms. Do not regret things about your own personal life. Do not envy another's good or evil. Do not lament parting on any road whatsoever. Do not complain or feel bitterly about yourself or others. Have no heart for approaching the path of love. Do not have preferences. Do not harbor hopes for your own personal home. Do not have a liking for delicious food for yourself. Do not carry antiques handed down from generation to generation. Do not fast so that it affects you physically. While it's different with military equipment, do not be fond of material things. While on the way, do not begrudge death. Do not be intent on possessing valuables or a fief in old age. Respect the gods and Buddhas, but do not depend on them. Though you give up your life, do not give up your honor. Never depart from the way of the martial arts. 12th day of the 5th month, 2nd year of Shōhō, 1645, Shinmen Musashi.